Welcome to the Private School Leader Podcast, where private school leaders learn how to thrive and not just survive as they serve and lead their schools. I strongly believe that it is possible to have a long and happy and fulfilling career as a private school leader. And my passion is to help you figure out exactly how to do just that, right here on the Private School Leader Podcast. And I'm your host, Mark Minkus. So to start today's episode, I want to talk for just a moment about fire. And when I think about fire, I think about the gas grill in my backyard. And I love cooking, grilling on the barbecue grill in the backyard. And I think that, a burger and a hot dog, they just taste different when they're, grilled in my backyard. And then when I think about fire, I think about the fire pit in my backyard, and we don't use it very much anymore, but when my daughter still lived at home on a nice summer evening, go out there and just sit around the little fire in the fire pit and roast some marshmallows and make s'mores. And then I think about a bonfire, and there's a Christmas village not too far from our house, and around Christmas time, we go and you walk around and you look at the lights, and then when you get cold, there's a big bonfire kind of in the middle of everything, and you grab some hot chocolate and sit there and just warm up by this big bonfire. And here's the thing, with a grill or a fire pit or a bonfire, you kind of have this small, controlled fire that can make delicious food or make some memories making s'mores, or warm you up when you're cold from walking around looking at Christmas lights. But fire, when it's not small and controlled, can be absolutely devastating. And I'm thinking about the Maui wildfires from a couple of years ago, the Pacific Palisades fire. Just those two fires, the utter devastation and loss of life, over 125 people killed and over $30 billion in damage. And so you've heard it say that too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. And many of our schools have warm, close-knit, loving communities where everyone knows everyone. Sometimes, if it's a church school or religious school, a lot of the families and the teachers even go to the same church. Many times the friends, the kids in the school, their friends are all kids that go to the school. And then the parents, sometimes their friends are the parents of the kids, parents in the same grade as their children. And a warm, close-knit, loving community where everybody knows everybody is awesome until it's not awesome. Because on today's episode of the Private School Leader Podcast, we are going to discuss what to do when the best thing about your school is also the worst thing about your school. And just for a second, before we jump into that, I have a quick question for you. What's the name of the parent that is living rent-free in your head today? What's the name of the parent that's living rent-free in your head today? Listen, I know how busy you are, and I know that you've got so much going on at school and at home. I just want that parent to move out, because sometimes we get a little bit emotionally dysregulated, we get distracted, and if it's a parent that's being relentless and we have to have a meeting with them, or there's a situation that's going on, that parent who causes you to have a certain feeling inside when you get an email from them or a phone call from them. We all have those parents in our school. But I want to give you strategies to get that parent to move out, to stop living rent-free in your head. And Parent Academy, the first 4 modules, will give you the strategies to deal with that issue of that parent being in your head, and to give you strategies to have better meetings and to work with parents and to also control how much headspace they're taking up. And then after the first 4 modules, there's 2 plug-and-play PD webinars where then I can teach your teachers the same things. And it's been a game changer for a lot of leaders and a lot of teachers in a lot of schools. And I want that to be the case for you as the leader and for your teachers as well. So if you want to check out more information about that, just go to theprivateschoolleader.com/Parent Academy. And then speaking of things that might take up headspace, I know that working with the board over the years could be great, but it also could be really, really stressful. And a lot of that depends on the board, and a lot of that depends on what's going on at your school currently. And so I'm excited to share with you a resource that I created fairly recently, and it's called the 6 Keys to Improving Your Relationship with Your Board. And the most important relationship in our schools is the one between the board and the head of school. And I just think that there's always room for improvement. So this is a free guide. It's a 7-page PDF, and I give you specific strategies to strengthen your relationship with your board members and with your board chair. So go to theprivateschoolleader.com/board to grab your free copy of the 6 Keys to Improving Your Relationship with Your Board. That is theprivateschoolleader.com/board. And just a way to say thank you for listening to the podcast every week. So I told you that we have these things in our school that we're pursuing as far as culture. And even larger schools, they want to maintain that small school feel of being close-knit school community. And what I want to do today is to, first of all, talk about 5 ways that that can be the best thing about your school. And then 5 ways that that could become one of the worst things about your school. And then give you 5 strategies to keep the best thing from becoming the worst thing. So let's start by talking about 5 ways that this warm, close-knit community where everybody knows everybody is the best thing about your school. So the first thing I was thinking of is that it causes deep trust and a feeling of belonging. And I think that that's incredibly important, is this sense of belonging, that they're part of something. I think that there's a lot of research out there to show that even though with the proliferation of social media and the ability to be able to connect, quote unquote, connect with people all over the world and people in our family, and a lot of it is great, but the research shows that as a society that people are feeling more disconnected and more lonely than ever before. And so our families, our teachers, our students, they want to feel known. They want to feel accepted. They want to feel a sense of belonging. They want to feel like they're part of something. And when your school is that place, that hub of engagement, that place where that deep psychological safety has a place to grow, then your school feels like a family. And family is awesome most of the time. And so if you have a community feel, a culture like that at your school, that's a really, really good thing, that deep trust and belonging. And so that's the first way that this is the best thing about our school. And number 2 is that there's generally loyalty and long-term commitment that comes from having this be part of your school culture. So if you have a really close school community where everyone knows everyone and it's warm and it's loving and tight-knit, then those close connections, typically the student retention rates are high. You usually have teachers who stick around because the culture is good. And then what I've seen, and maybe you've seen this too, one of my favorite things was when the alumni, the graduates, would come back for a visit. So the graduates stay connected because they love that. And I saw this, especially when, post-COVID, when kids who were in high school, in college, our school went up to 8th grade, they would want to come back to feel that connection to something, and they felt that connection to their school when they attended the school. So alumni staying connected, and then reputationally, there's a magnetism there when the school has that secret sauce of, that warm, small school feel, that community feel, and donors, grandparents, you get loyalty and long-term commitment. The third reason that this is the best thing about your school is because typically there's really strong support when there's a crisis. So when you have a tight-knit school community, if there's a parent who is going through some kind of physical problem, let's say that they're having double knee replacement, or they have, a mom has breast cancer and she's getting treatments. Maybe it's a faculty member whose parent passes away. Usually when bad things happen in this type of a community, the community rallies and shows up for each other. And so, you start a meal train and people are providing meals. There's prayers, there's moral support, there's texts or cards that are encouraging. There's real practical help that's given, and there's strong support. And, that mutual care of each other, taking care of each other like a close family, that's priceless. Like that, if you think back to times when, whether it was at your school or at your church or in your own family, when everyone had everyone's back, when the times got tough, that felt really, really amazing, and it was really important, and it helped you get through the really hard thing. And so our schools, when we have this awesome part of our school, there's usually strong support in bad times, hard times. The fourth reason that I think that this can be the best thing about your school is because there's usually a high level of volunteerism and collaboration. And so usually when there's a tight-knit school community, volunteerism is pretty high. There's a good energy around it. Parents, grandparents, alumni, mentoring students, meals, the grandparent helping out in the library. And this is just such a good thing for our schools, and it's something that's elusive that we're always trying to pursue. But when we have that close-knit community, generally that's pretty high. And then fifth, and perhaps most important, is that you have a beautiful culture that just continues to grow into even a more beautiful culture. So these relationships, these close relationships, this love for the school, this school spirit, and let's say it's wrapped up in kindness, and kind of reflects the core values of the school, or things in the mission statement. Maybe it's kindness, maybe it's service, maybe it's integrity. And the students then absorb those values. And isn't that one of the most rewarding things for you as a private school leader, when you see the teachers bought in, you see the kids bought in, and they're just, I saw this phrase when I was preparing for the episode. It says that the sense of community becomes a living curriculum. What an awesome thing to pursue. The sense of this, the warm community becomes a living curriculum. And then that not only shapes the character of the kids, but this culture, it's just, it's beautiful, and it grows, and it's amazing, and it feels amazing. So those are the reasons, those are some of the things that you see that show that this is the best thing about your school. But this issue, this thing we're pursuing, this thing that many of us have, this close-knit, warm, loving community where everybody knows everybody, can also become the worst thing about your school. So I'm going to tell you 5 ways that happens, and then I'm going to give you 5 strategies to help prevent that from happening. So the first thing that happens that's not awesome is favoritism, and favoritism that forms informal hierarchies. So these really, really close relationships, they can lead to real favoritism or even just perceived favoritism. That can happen on the staff, on the faculty, with teachers who've been there for a really long time. And maybe because they've been there a long time and maybe they're a bit of a squeaky wheel, then maybe they don't have as many duties as another younger teacher. Or, there's some favoritism among the teachers. But there can also be favoritism, sort of an informal hierarchy with the families. Let's think about it. Sometimes the last name of a family means more than the last name of a different family. And that could be that they've had 4 kids who've been there from preschool through 12th grade, and this is kid number 4, and they're in 10th grade, and this is just an iconic family in the school. And it could be because their name is on a different family, their name is on the gym, or because the grandparents are the chair of the grandparent committee and they're the biggest donors of the school. And we all have that, but when those, let's say the status of those activities causes favoritism or a hierarchy, then it just really erodes trust and fairness. And I would go further and say it's sort of like a Jenga tower, and the trust, that sense of fairness, your integrity as the leader, your perceived, whether you're playing favorites or not, that Jenga tower, it's kind of like pulling out one of the blocks on the bottom row. It can really negatively impact how people perceive you. So reason number 2 that this close-knit community can be the worst thing about your school is because of a lack of boundaries and expectations of access. So I have a lot of coaching clients who have a church that is attached to their school. Their school is a ministry of the church. And so you have a church where the leader goes to that church. Most of the parents of the school, maybe even most of the teachers of the school go to that church. The board members. I know what it's like to go to a church where all but one of my board members went to that church too. And a lot of the adults who had children who were attending my church had kids in the school that I led. And then even if it's not at the church, it might be in the same community, the grocery store, you're going to work out at the gym, there's a birthday party at the trampoline park, and you're just completely surrounded, it feels like most of the time, with people from the school. And so these warm relationships and close-knit community and everybody knows everybody, that leads to sometimes parents and teachers and board members expecting 24/7 access to you, or staff members or parents that are asking for exceptions to the rules in the student handbook or the employee handbook. And when those lines between personal and professional start to blur, that makes consistent following of the policies of the school really messy. When those lines between personal and professional blur, it makes things pretty messy. And you've experienced that most likely. So another way that this could be the worst thing about your school is there's a lot of conflict avoidance and what I'll call toxic politeness. So think about that idea of toxic politeness. In communities, in a school community where everyone is valuing, just getting along and being harmonious and having peace, then most of the time those people avoid the hard conversations. That's what toxic politeness is. It's when the definition I looked up is toxic politeness is when people value being nice so much that they avoid honesty, accountability, or necessary conflict, and the result is actually harmful, not helpful, end quote. That's not great, but we also know that happens in our schools. And so it leads to problems that fester, and I have here in my notes, student discipline, teacher performance, financial stress, I would kick those cans down the road. You don't want to make waves. Everyone wants to be polite. And then, boom, all of a sudden the lids come off all the boxes and someone's super upset or something becomes a crisis. I also think, number 4, on problems that, come out of this being kind of the worst thing about your school is that there's often an over-reliance on social capital instead of systems. And let me explain what I mean by that. When I say there's an over-reliance on social capital instead of systems, I'm thinking about, we'll just go ask Julie to handle that. We'll go ask Margaret to handle that. We'll go ask Steve to handle that. We'll go ask Paul to handle that. Insert name of head of school here. So they don't follow the procedure of complaint procedure. They just we'll just go, when you have all those close relationships, then they just want to go and talk to the person. They don't want to talk to the teacher. They don't want to talk to the division head. They just want to talk to the person that they know. And then the work that goes on in our schools, especially the interactions between parents, and sometimes this is true for teachers, that it depends on relationships instead of what is the policy, what is the process, what is the system. And then the other problem with that is that when you're relying too much on a person and not enough on a system, is when that person leaves, then things fall apart. And you've experienced that, or you've at least heard about it, where there was this iconic leader that everybody loved and everybody knew, and it was just this kind of smaller school with this warm community, everybody has everyone's back, so on and so forth, and that leader retires, and then things fall apart because there weren't any systems, or not enough systems. And then finally, the 5th reason that I came up with that sometimes this is the worst part of our school is what I'll call gatekeeping and exclusivity, being exclusive, gatekeeping and being exclusive. Excluding people doesn't just happen at the middle school lunch table, because all that warmth can also have kind of this unspoken criteria for belonging. And while many of our schools do a really good job of integrating new families who come to the school, some of us have schools where that isn't as easy. And especially if the new family doesn't fit, quote unquote, the demographic or the ideology or the political ideology or the socioeconomic structure of the people kind of in the group, then that person feels like second-class citizen, the country cousin. They feel unwelcome. And so I'm not saying this happens all the time, but I'm saying that a lot of these things can happen some of the time. So if I've identified the things that help make having a tight-knit, warm, loving community where everyone knows everyone, I've identified 5 things that make that the best thing about your school, and I've tried to shine a light on the 5 things that could make that the worst thing about your school. Then how can we keep the best thing the best thing? How can we keep the best thing from becoming the worst thing? Well, I'm going to give you 5 strategies. And these will all be there for you in the show notes at theprivateschoolleader.com/episode 162. So let me just give you 5 strategies real quick. Strategy number 1, clarify and communicate boundaries. Kind but clear. Brene Brown says, clear is kind. Unclear is unkind. So you as the leader, what is sustainable is for you to have boundaries where you're not accessible 24/7. But then a lot of you, I know this because a lot of the people that I coach, a lot of the leaders that I coach struggle with this, is that you feel like you're being a jerk. And this is especially true when everyone knows everyone. But you can't sustain 24/7 access. There are very, very few jobs when someone, the leader, is accessible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, especially from the clients of that organization. If you think about CPAs or attorneys or therapists or dentists, they're not accessible 24/7. That's ludicrous to even think that you could call your attorney or to call your dentist at 7 p.m. Or talk to them at the grocery store about a problem that's happening with you. But that's what happens in our lives as private school leaders, right? And so to clarify and communicate these boundaries, it's like, first of all, who? Who are we talking about? It's like, well, we're talking about you, but it's like, when do your teachers have access to you? And I'm talking about like the tier 1 stuff and maybe even some tier 2 stuff that can wait. But of course your teachers probably all have your cell phone and they can text you. But if that's happening way too much, but here's the problem. There's a lot of leaders have a lot of parents in their phone. And I get it. Like if you've got a 2nd grader, a 5th grader, and an 8th grader, then the parents of most of the kids in those grades are probably in your phone or in your spouse or partner's phone. So it gets pretty tricky, right? So just clarifying and communicating the when. It's reasonable to limit those communications unless it's an emergency or a crisis to like 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. on weekdays, kind of like office hours or school hours. How come every organization that's a professional organization, whether it's the corporate world or the professional service industry, like I talked about with CPAs and therapists and attorneys and dentists, etc., why do they all have office hours and yet our office hours are 24/7, 7 days a week? That's not sustainable. So it could be the who, the parents, teachers. It could be the when, school hours on weekdays, and then it's the where, church, out in the community. You're like, well, I don't have a policy on that. Well, you could get an assist from ChatGPT on that. And then the family handbook, the employee handbook, the board handbook, that's where we need to communicate those boundaries. Back to school, the welcome back email that they get in August, especially if there's if it's a church school, because I know what it's like to go to church for years, decades. And you want to go there and you want to reconnect with God and with your faith, and you want to sing some hymns and listen to some music and just kind of like reconnect and gain that benefit from that spiritual meditation. And it's incredibly difficult to do that because I always had my head on a swivel. Here comes a board member walking over and we're going to have a impromptu conversation about the budget, or this parent is going to walk over and we're going to have a conversation about what they don't like about the 2nd grade math curriculum, or about what's going on at the 6th grade girls' lunch table. And your head's on a swivel. And even if it's not at church, maybe it's on a swivel at the grocery store or at the gym, or when you're out and about with your family doing a little shopping. So, use examples to show how the boundaries can protect relationships. This is typical with something that you could do with your teachers. And then also train your staff on how to explain their boundaries with empathy, because your teachers, they're dealing with they're dealing with this too. And if you want to hang on to good teachers and you have this close-knit, warm community where everybody knows everyone / everyone's in everyone's business, your teachers have to have boundaries as well to kind of protect them from those impromptu conversations when they're not at school, or it's going to be harder to hang on to them. Okay, and then you know me well enough now that I'm going to talk about handbooks. And so the number 2 strategy is to lean into your handbooks. And I'm going to give you 4 quick ways that your handbooks can help you, okay? So the first is handbooks protect you from the downside of a close-knit community. So we've touched on this briefly, but when it comes to influential parents and longtime families and veteran teachers that expect special treatment, they're not bad people. They just have been around for a while, or they've donated a lot of money to the school, and they expect that they're going to get something that maybe others won't. But when your expectations in your school are kind of informal, then personal relationships drive the decisions. And then what happens is resentment, favoritism, inconsistency, that mushy gray area that I talked about before. And so your handbooks, your employee handbook, your student handbook, your family handbook, they create shared expectations, not special expectations. So let me say that again. Your handbooks create shared expectations, not special expectations. And sometimes, especially in smaller schools, and especially in church schools that are smaller schools, without a lot of clarity in the handbooks, then the administrator, the principal, the head of school gets really frustrated because everyone's always asking for these special things, but maybe we don't have those clearly written in our handbooks, and maybe we're not communicating them clearly. Of course, it's possible that people are going to still come at you with those requests for special situations, even if everything is clear. But the more that you have it laid out clearly in your handbooks, the more consistently that you communicate it, and the more consistently that you stick to those standards, you're going to have less of that. And then the second reason that your handbooks are so important is because following the handbook consistently is actually an act of kindness. See, sometimes we feel like we're being a jerk, or the parents feel like we're being a jerk. But I think that when we hide, here's the thing. You're not hiding behind policy. You're not hiding behind your handbook. I've been accused of that. Maybe you've been accused of that. What you're doing is you're protecting the relationship. And the way you're doing that is by making the process fair and predictable. When the process isn't fair and predictable, you've got chaos. And so a clear boundary is kindness. Clear is kind. When the boundary is moving all over the place, that causes frustration, confusion, lack of trust, resentment, bitterness. I'm not saying your handbooks fix everything, but I'm saying that it can fix a lot when it comes to this particular issue. And then the third reason is that the handbook allows you to say no without damaging trust. So instead of saying, well, I don't want to do that, or I can't do that because I don't agree with you, you can say, or our handbook says, ... and we apply this consistently with every family. You have to do that so that you can say that honestly. But what it does is it shifts the conversation away from how strong the personality is of that person and the backroom politics and the backroom deals, and it gets it back on what the handbook says and on the policy and back on mission. And I struggled with this for years, where I would say yes to some families or to some teachers and say no to others, and it negatively impacted my reputation, and it really held our school back. And then the fourth reason that the handbook can help is that it's the antidote to the back channel culture. I'll call it the back channel culture. And you know what I'm talking about. Texting a board member, talking to the coach, but not at a time that's great, right after a game, the parent comes up and blah, blah, using social pressure, using socioeconomic pressure, talking to a teacher at the grocery store. They try to solve, the parent sometimes tries to solve the problem by leveraging their relationship with that person instead of going through proper channels. So that's the back channel culture that I'm talking about. Well, if you keep pointing them back to the handbook and to this is our policy and this is our procedure, this is our system, then the process of complaining or asking for things becomes professional. It becomes more equitable instead of it being always relational and subjective and based on your mood or how emotionally dysregulated you are, or how tired you are, or how frustrated you are, or how close it is to Thanksgiving break or winter break. I've been there, and I've said yes to stuff that I shouldn't say just because I was depleted physically and emotionally. Our policies protect us from that. All right, that was my sidebar. I'll get off my soapbox about the handbooks. But number 3 on our list of how to prevent the best thing from becoming the worst thing is to get obsessive about following the complaint procedure and make sure that everyone else is doing it too. So whether it's, in most schools, it's like, did you talk to the teacher first? And then if there's a division head, did you involve the division head? And then it goes to the head of school. And then if they don't agree, they go over the head of school and maybe talk to the board chair. There's a procedure. There's an escalation. But if you don't follow that, you're going to have problems. And so everyone all the time. And so I mean you, and I mean your board kicking it back down to you. I mean you saying, did you talk to that teacher? And then making them talk to the teacher. I know how hard this is of what I'm saying, because I remember how hard it was for me, but we finally started to get it right, and it made things so much better. Everyone has to follow this all the time. Get obsessive about the complaint procedure. And then number 4, how to keep the best thing from becoming the worst thing is you need to have regular, structured, anonymous feedback. And so if that's an annual parent survey that's anonymous, whether it's an exit interview for people that are leaving, but I'm a big believer of once a year, a pretty thorough survey where it's anonymous and you're asking very similar questions each year so you can compare the data. And then there has to be a feedback loop where you're sharing the themes or some of the results of that, not necessarily the open-ended comments, but you're sharing that back out with the teachers and with the parents, or they're going to stop filling out the survey if they never hear anything about, well, what were the results of the survey and what's the school doing to move in a direction. And so when you get that feedback anonymously, regularly, and they know it's coming, it, in my experience, does help to reduce that toxic politeness, because at least people have an outlet to say what they really think instead of just not saying it, and then it festers until it turns into a real problem. I think it lets problems surface earlier. It's just a really good thing for schools to do in general, but it's a good thing for schools to do in particular when we're talking about this issue. And then finally, number 5 on how to keep the best thing from becoming the worst thing is to adopt a decision-making framework and stick to it. You probably have a decision-making framework, but here's where I'm going. If you have this is how we make decisions, the criteria, and does it align with our mission? Do we have the money? What's the financial impact? What's the benefit to the students? Is it equitable? Some of those things. If we have some kind of framework, some kind of thing to ground us when we're making a decision, then what it does is it reduces decisions that are based on doing a favor for someone that's in the school community. And then it also makes this decision more defensible, because what if an influential family wants the basketball team to get new uniforms and they're putting pressure on you to do that? What if the pastor of the church really loves performing arts and he wants you to spend big bucks that aren't in the budget on the spring musical? You can insert, preference and level of influence here as you think about how sometimes things just pop up. There's pressure, and then there's a decision. Well, if we have a decision-making framework that's grounded in the cost and the benefit to the students and equity, and is it aligned with mission, is it in the budget, that's going to reduce those granting a favor type decisions in our schools. And let's face it, those happen more often when it's a close-knit, warm, loving, smaller community or a smaller field community, even in a big school. That can reduce that significantly. So let's review. 5 ways a close-knit, warm, loving community is wonderful. Deep trust and belonging, loyalty and long-term commitment, high retention, strong support when there's a crisis, high levels of volunteerism, and a beautiful culture grows in your school. The 5 ways that same close-knit, loving community where everyone knows everyone can be the worst thing about your school is when there's favoritism and informal hierarchies, when there's a lack of boundaries and a 24/7, 365 expectation of access to you and your teachers, when there's number 3, conflict avoidance and toxic politeness, And then when there's an over-reliance on social capital and social relationship instead of systems, and then sometimes there's some exclusion and there's some gatekeeping for new families coming into the school. That's when it's the worst thing. And so then what are the 5 strategies to keep the best thing from becoming the worst thing? Clarify and communicate boundaries. Lean into your handbooks for all the reasons that I stated. Get obsessive about following the complaint procedure and make sure everyone's doing it. Have regular structured anonymous feedback at least once a year, but maybe even more often than that. And then have a decision-making framework and stick to it. Is that going to fix all your problems? No, but it's going to get you going in the right direction, especially if you've drifted and if any of the things that I've talked about today has turned on a light bulb for you about, ooh, boy, this is kind of, how did we get here? This is going on at my school. So your call to action for today's episode is ask yourself, does my practice align with my handbooks? Does my practice align with my handbooks? And if not, then start improving the alignment by making some tougher decisions, or, perhaps it's about the language and this isn't something that we do anymore. And maybe for next year, then you need to change your handbook. But call to action, ask yourself, does my practice align with my handbooks? Okay, so let's wrap it up. Just a quick reminder, the 6 keys to improving your relationship with your board. You can get that at theprivateschoolleader.com/board. And then if the parents are relentless and they're living rent-free in your head, reminder, those first 4 modules of Parent Academy will teach you how to get them to move out. And you can learn more about that at theprivateschoolleader.com/Parent Academy. The show notes are there for you at theprivateschoolleader.com/episode 162. And I'd really appreciate it if you would share a link to the podcast with another leader that you know or a rising leader at your school. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking some of your precious time to join me here today. I've been your host, Mark Minkus, and I'm so grateful for all of the hard work that you do at your school. And I'll see you next time right here on the Private School Leader Podcast. And until then, always remember to serve first, lead second, and make a difference.